I'm going to begin talking, so it's a good time to leave. I don't take it personally, not to worry. We're going to shade the discussion a little bit now toward ISIS, and from Lori's discussion of international law to my discussion of domestic law as an example of how we frame conflict questions, particularly toward their termination. I want to make a couple of comments, though, about what's been said so far. I can't help myself, because I think in a project that's called When Conflicts End, it is important to frame very carefully the nature of the inquiry. And I think both Daphne and Brian were very helpful, I think, in talking about the front end, what we've done historically and what we do in contemporary times about labeling conflict, what we call things. Daphne's history, I think, about the war and the laws of war is particularly illuminating, and I think one of the things that history shows is that we have not been very clear in defining our war objectives, what the criteria might be for achieving success. We're notoriously open-ended. We don't want to commit. We're not sure. We're too damn surprised by what's happened. We're tied up in knots. For whatever reasons, that shortcoming at the outset complicates the difficulties later on. Second comment is about declarations. Brian's recitation of the U.S. history of declarations of war is very useful, I think. And he mentioned, I think most importantly, that we declared war in the United States in part for a very important purpose of letting the American people know what we were up to, and that the people themselves should stand up for this conflict that we have entered into. We've lost that. Not only has the United States stopped declaring war, 1942 being the last time, and we certainly wouldn't say that the United States has been at peace consistently in the decades since, but the last declaration in the world was in Israel in 1967. Nations do not declare war anymore. And something has been lost, I think, by the passing of that institution. Now, you could say, I will say, that the reason declarations are passé is that the United Nations Charter in 1945 made war unlawful. So that now wars that are fought are legally, necessarily defensive, because the concept of offensive war was taken off the table in an international treaty that virtually every nation subscribes to. But somehow along the way, that was a tremendous advance toward world peace. There for a shining moment, there was hope. But we've lost something as well. About the AUMF, the particular one that I will focus on now when I get to ISIS in just a moment, Brian's reminding me of the story of Rich Armitage. I've heard that one too. Yeah, we can go after everybody with this AUMF. It's so broad. We could even get Hezbollah. No. It said you have to be responsible for 9/11. Hezbollah wasn't. There were limits even to that AUMF. There was a famous period in U.S. history in the early days of the Vietnam War when the U.S. authorization to fight in Vietnam was pursuant to something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, enacted by Congress after virtually no debate in suspicious circumstances in 1964. Not worth telling the story. But years later, it was so broad that the commander-in-chief could do virtually anything. And after Johnson's period in the Oval Office was over, his biographer, Doris Kearns Goodwin, was interviewing him at the Texas ranch, and she got to that period, and she asked LBJ what he thought of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. He says, reminded me, he's a Texan, reminded me of Grandma's nightshirt, it covered everything. Now that's Johnson's colloquial humor, but it illustrates the breadth of language that Congress could use in the United States to unleash the power of war of the executive branch, sometime without a lot of accountable criteria. And I think that's where we are with ISIS. I'm frankly pretty skeptical about this end of war stuff with regard to ISIS. I don't see it coming to an end. I'm not sure what's going to happen in Afghanistan. I don't know what in the world is going on in Syria, but ISIS is recurring. I'm going to defer to Asaf here in a little while to talk about the ongoing threats posed by ISIS, but unless he persuades me otherwise, I think it's still a problem. It is. Yeah, and I think it's going to be a problem for a while. What we do in the United States is not representative of what all nations in the world do about this kind of problem. What we do in the United States since 9/11 is to rely on an AUMF that was put in place 3 or 4 days after the worst terrorist attack in our history that did cover grandma's nightshirt. If you're in any way responsible for or harbored those involved in 9/11, we're going to come and get you. And that's what we've been doing for 18 years. President Trump, like every president before him since George W. Bush, has written to Congress every few months detailing the current scope of military operations. The latest letter from President Trump was dated this June, and it's essentially boilerplate. It says that the United States' participation in military operations are pursuant to my constitutional and statutory authority as Commander-in-Chief and Chief Executive, including the authority to carry out the AUMF and other statutes, as well as my constitutional and statutory authority to conduct foreign relations in the United States. In other words, everything I've got. And then he lists all the places where the United States may be involved in military operations abroad. It would take me a couple of minutes to read the whole list, but here goes: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Arabian Peninsula, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, East Africa, Lake Chad Basin, Sahel region, Cuba, Philippines, Egypt, Gabon, Kosovo. Thank you very much. Time to play golf. It's almost like that. It's perfunctory, and it's done every 3 months just as an inventory matter. Now, the Obama White House was virtually indistinguishable in terms of the way they've legally framed the scope of the authority to conduct conflict against ISIS and other associated groups. Beginning with President George W. Bush, the presidents of the United States have construed the AUMF to reach groups associated with al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Early on, as we know, that included ISIS, because as someone here already mentioned, perhaps it was Lori, that group, ISIS, began as al-Qaeda in Iraq. Dating back to the time the group first affiliated with al-Qaeda in 2004, ISIL's position, supported by some individual members and some factions of al-Qaeda-aligned groups, is that it is the true inheritor of Osama bin Laden's legacy, all of this notwithstanding the public split between al-Qaeda's senior leadership and ISIL that occurred somewhere later. So critics in the United States and elsewhere have argued against this expansive use of the authority under the AUMF to continue to fight ISIS in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, or elsewhere, because ISIS, following that public split between the leadership and Zawahiri, was no longer the group that was al-Qaeda in Iraq. Therefore, it's simply a torture of language and the concept behind the AUMF to reach the current version or incarnation of ISIS through the AUMF. The fact is, whether Republican or Democrat, the administrations in the White House have simply continued to assert that ISIL is one of those groups that may be combated using the original AUMF authority. No president has wavered. Congresses in the United States have considered carefully lots of revisions to the AUMF, repeal initiatives of the AUMF, substitute AUMFs which would more specifically focus on ISIS and perhaps even more specifically focus on a geographic zone in which that form of combat could be conducted. None of those iterations have advanced as law, and I think there's little likelihood, at least between now and the 2020 election in the United States, that anything of that nature is going to happen. The most recent one that had some chance of enactment last year was a bipartisan bill. A number of these have been good bipartisan efforts by Republicans and Democrats. This one would have explicitly permitted military operations against al-Qaeda, the Taliban, ISIS, and designated associated forces. Pay attention to that phrase, designated associated forces. It did not authorize attacks against any nation state and therefore couldn't be used against any future strikes at the time against the Assad regime in Syria. And what the mechanism would do would be to allow the president to classify new groups as associated forces. So there would be a sort of line in the sand at the time of the enactment. Here are the designated groups, but Mr. President or Madam President, you may designate new ones following a process that's outlined in the bill. That was not a bad idea. It advanced pretty far in the legislative process. One of the weaknesses of that measure was that it did not have a sunset. It did not point toward the criteria which would achieve success, the end of conflict. In other words, it would be ongoing. It's generally bad government in democracies to allow permanent legislation, just my point of view. We should always sunset authorities like this so that smarter people can come back down the road and take another look at what we did a few years ago. The Trump administration has only shaded the legal authority arguments slightly in the 2.5 years of its administration. What they're doing more than the Obama administration had done was to rely also on the president's constitutional authority to take war or combat or armed conflict to ISIS. Under Article 2 of the Constitution, as many of you know, the president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Kids in the United States learn in a civics class in the 5th grade that means that he takes up the cudgel and wages the war after the Congress has decided to launch it. That's fine, but we know in the modern era now Congress doesn't declare war. Maybe they'll articulate an AUMF, but once they do it, they tend to walk away and not revisit it for a long time. So that in practical effect, the sort of war-making authority or power of the presidency has overshadowed the war-deciding authority of the Congress. The president is, by all practical measures, he holds the hammer, and he decides what to do and when to do it. So relying on his Article 2 authority, what he's done in many cases, even President Trump in a handful of cases in the 2.5 years, is he has said that I have constitutional authority to strike back at Assad's regime in Syria, for example, when they used chemical weapons on 2 different occasions. Even though the United States wasn't directly attacked then, he found that the threat to our personnel on the ground in Syria, the threat to our friends and allies in the region in Syria, and the significant humanitarian catastrophe that was being wrought by the Syrian state, the Syrian government on the Syrian people, unleashed some modicum of the president's defensive war power apart from any statutory authority in the AUMF and otherwise. So pay attention to that argument because it's a little bit different than the historical arguments of the president. he would say, the President, Trump, through his advisors, that none of these things I've done amount to war in the constitutional sense. I'm protecting our allies. I'm protecting American interests abroad. I'm averting a deeper humanitarian catastrophe. It's not war, he says. It's not combat. Notice how the words matter. I see this continuing. And until there's a Congress in place that has the strength of principle, they should be paying attention to goings on in the Parliament the last couple of weeks. The strength of principle to rise up and articulate a position that would require the president to start over again and go forward against ISIS, and then when there's a new associated group to designate it as such so that we know who it is. Then, as Brian said a little earlier, we, the American people, would be on the record too as supporting a conflict of some designated scope and nature. Why don't I leave it right there?